Welcome to the Adoah podcast with Amar Jackson, Derek Morales, and Norman Nasson, where we're going to talk about The Stranger by Albert Camus, who won the Nobel Prize in 1957 for literature. The book is an existentialist fiction about a man who is drawn into a senseless murder.
Ahmad is going to begin the analysis of the book with the reading of his chosen page and his explanation on why he chose and read the page a certain way.
It was this burning, which I couldn't stand anymore, that made me move forward. I knew that it was stupid, that I wouldn't get the sun off me by stepping forward, but I took one step forward, and this time, without getting up, the Arab drew his knife and held it up to me in the sun. The light shot off the steel, and it was like a long, hashing blade cutting at my forehead. At the same instant, the sweat of my eyebrows dripped down over my eyelids all at once and covered them with a warm, thick film. My eyes were blinded behind the curtain of tears and salt. All I could feel were the symbols of sunlight crashing on my forehead, and indistinctly the dazzling spear hanging up from the knife in front of me. The scorching blade slashed at my eyelashes and stabbed at my stinging eyes. That's when everything began to reel. The sea carried up a thick, fiery breath. It seemed to me as if the sky split open from one end to the other end to rain down fire. My whole being tensed, and I squeezed my hand around the revolver. The trigger gave. I felt the smooth underside of the butt, and there, in that noise, sharp and deafening at the same time, is where it all started. I shook off the sweat, and son, I knew that I had shattered the harmony of the day. The exceptional silence of a breath where I'd been happy, then I'd fired 4 more times at the motionless body, where the bullets lodged without leaving a trace. And it was like knocking 4 quick times on the door of unhappiness. I chose my page because it is a turning point in the book where he makes a decision that he can never take back, even if he tries. And I read it dramatically to give it more emphasis to the situation and show the pull on the situation.
Our analysis of The Stranger is going to continue with my reading of my chosen page. I went with him as far as the bungalow, and as he climbed up the wooden steps, I just stood there, at the bottom, my head ringing from the sun, unable to face the effort it would take to climb the wooden staircase and face the women again. But the heat was so intense that it was just as bad standing still in the blinding stream falling from the sky. To stay or to go. It all amounted to the same thing. A minute later, I turned back toward the beach and started walking. There was the same dazzling red glare. The sea gasped for air with each shallow, stifled little wave that broke on the sand. I was walking slowly toward the rocks, and I could feel my forehead swelling under the sun. All that heat was pressing down on me, making it hard for me to go on. And every time I felt a blast of its hot breath strike my face, I gritted my teeth, clenched my fists in my trouser pockets, and strained every nerve in order to overcome the sun and the thick drunkenness it was spilling over me. With every blade of light that hashed off the sand, from a bleached shell or a piece of broken glass, my jaws tightened. I walked for a long time. From a distance, I could see the small, dark mass of rock surrounded by a blinding halo of light and sea spray. I was thinking of the cool spring running behind the rock. I wanted to hear the murmur of its water again, to escape the sun and the strain and the woman's tears, and to find shade and rest again at last. But as I got closer, I saw that Raymond's man had come back. Before I talk about why I read the page the way that I did, I'm going to talk about why I chose the page in general. This page really stood out to me when I was reading the book because he talks about heat a lot and how the heat is like always a reoccurring factor in how he's feeling and what he's thinking and what he does. And it's like a certain thing throughout the whole book, even in the early parts through like in the end of the book when he's in jail, he's constantly talking about the heat and how it's affecting him. So that's pretty much a main factor of why I chose this page. Um, so my choice of emphasis when reading this is obviously each and every time it talks about heat and the effects that the heat has on him in this page, I tend to take a longer time reading and also like very clearly pronouncing each word just to make sure it sticks because that's just how much of an effect the heat was having on the character. And I also thought of it like in the moment with all the commas as he's like talking about climbing up the wooden steps and like deciding to go or not. It's like a kind of like you would imagine a slow process because he's just so beat by the heat. So it's kind of like I read it how I think he would have said it in person. I think reading this page helped me learn like how the character acts off not only like emotional feelings but off how he's feeling physically because prior to like being indulged in the heat he was like a very chill and like relaxed person and he's not like obviously like committing crimes when he's not being affected by the heat but then after he's having the physical effects of the heat he like talks about being tense and not relaxed like clenched fists tight jaw and he's just like noticing all these little discomforts when he's like being in the heat and in the sun. So I think that helped me understand that he is someone who's influenced by his physical state rather than his emotional state. The next part of our analysis is going to show how cruelty and acts of cruelty play a big role in the theme and the plot of the book. Cruelty plays a big role in the plot and the theme of The Stranger by Albert Camus, which is a novel categorized under the genre of absurdist fiction. Cruelty and acts of cruelty are a common reoccurrence in the book The Stranger, and they also contribute to the theme and the plot of the book. The first taste of cruelty that we get in the book comes from Raymond Sintez, who is commonly known as a pimp. Raymond lives in the main character Mersault's building, and Raymond ends up inviting Mersault over to his house for dinner. And during the time that Mersault spends in Raymond's apartment, Raymond speaks on the topic of beating up his mistress, or I would say girlfriend at the time, because he had found out that she had been cheating on him, which is obviously an act of cruelty. And this led to Raymond getting into a fight with his mistress's brother. And now that that's happened, Raymond seems to find enjoyment in torturing the mistress. And he basically just wants to see her suffer and like wants bad things to happen to her, which is acts of cruelty. This first act of cruelty kind of plays the role of like a test in the plot. Like it kind of lets the reader understand what kind of person Mersault is at the beginning of the story and how he reacts to being exposed to this kind of activity. Once he hears about how Raymond is abusing his mistress or his girlfriend, he kind of believes that Raymond is in the wrong at the start, and then through the influence of Raymond, he kind of starts leaning towards Raymond's side and even decides to help him torment the mistress even more. So, the function of the first act of cruelty in the book is kind of like a test to see if and how Meursault would react to an act of cruelty. So the next act of cruelty happens to be coming from the main character Meursault himself. And this act of cruelty is definitely the worst and the most severe act of cruelty that happens in the book. This act of cruelty happens the Sunday following Raymond's conflict, when Meursault decides to go to the beach with Marie, his girlfriend at the time, along with Raymond and one of his friends, Masson, who happens to own a beach house. And once they've been to the beach and had their fun, they decide to have a lunch, and they go back to the beach house. But then Raymond, Masson, and Meursault decide to go on a walk on the beach, where they run into the mistress's brother and his friends. And of course, with the tensions between Raymond and the mistress's brother, a fight breaks out, which begins as a fist fight and ends up with Raymond being stabbed, and Meursault and Masson decide to help Raymond to a doctor to tend to his wounds. After that, Raymond is pretty mad and decides he wants to go on another walk alone, but Meursault insists on coming along. And on this walk, they come across the Arabs again at the spring, and Meursault actually talks Raymond out of committing cruelty. He talks Raymond out of shooting the Arabs at the spring, but later Meursault decides to go on a walk by himself, where he finds himself back at the spring, this time alone. But this time he has Raymond's gun in his pocket and decides to, for no reason, shoot Raymond's mistress's brother in cold blood, first out of nowhere, and following that with 4 more shots to the body, killing him in cold blood. This act of cruelty is very important to the theme because, as we know, The Stranger is a novel under the genre of absurdist fiction, which is based on the philosophy of absurdism. Basically, absurdism is an idea that life as a whole is meaningless and that the universe is irrational, and that plays into the theme of the book a lot because, as we know, Raymond is the one that had the conflict with the mistress's brother, not Meursault, so he had no reason to kill the mistress's brother, but he kind of does it anyways, and it's a very meaningless murder. He didn't have a good reason, or any reason at all, for that matter, to kill the mistress's brother in cold blood.
That was a great analysis done by my fellow partner here, Noah Manassan. And now I will read my page that I selected for the analysis of the book. And without further ado, here we go.
They sat down without a single chair creaking. I saw them more clearly than I had ever seen anyone, and not one detail of their faces or their clothes escaped me. But I couldn't hear them, and it was hard for me to believe they really existed. Almost all the women were wearing aprons, and the strings, which were tied tight around their waists, made their bulging stomachs stick out even more. I'd never noticed what huge stomachs old women can have. Almost all the men were skinny and carried canes. What struck me most about their faces was that I couldn't see their eyes, just a faint glimmer and a nest of wrinkles. When they sat down, most of them looked at me and nodded awkwardly, their lips sucked in by their toothless mouths, so that I couldn't tell if they were greeting me or if it was just a nervous tick. I think they were greeting me. It was then that I realized they were all sitting across from me, nodding their heads, grouped around the caretaker. For a second, I had a ridiculous feeling that they were there to judge me. Soon, one of the women started crying. She was in the second row, hidden behind one of her companions. I couldn't see her very well. She was crying softly, steadily, in little sobs. I thought she'd never stop. The others seemed not to hear her. They sat there, hunched up, gloomy and silent. They would look at the casket of their canes or whatever else, but that was all they would look at. The woman kept on crying. It surprised me, because I didn't know who she was. I wish I didn't have to listen to her anymore, but I didn't dare say anything. The caretaker leaned over and said something to her, but she took her head, mumbled something, and went on crying as much as before. Then the caretaker came around to my side. He sat down next to me. After a long pause, he explained, without looking at me, she was very close to your mother. She says your mother was her only friend, and now she hasn't gotten any. We just sat there, like for that while. The woman's sighs and sobs were quieting down. She sniffled a lot. And finally, she shut up. I didn't feel drowsy anymore, thank God. But I was tired and my back was hurting me.
The book The Stranger. The reason as to why I chose to pick those lines or to read, I find it very fascinating how the main character himself goes into in-depth explanation of the situation around him. And just the way he thinks and the way he acts isn't something you consider normal. And even though he's at a funeral, he isn't thinking like a person who would normally be at a funeral. A person who would be at a funeral would be more sad, more emotionally available, or like they would understand the emotions of people around them. But then he found everybody around him kind of annoying and had this tone of just being disgusted by the people around him and this like why are they acting like this kind of manner in the way he was speaking. And I feel like this kind of foreshadows what he is or who he is as a character further on in the story. Because further on in the story, we kind of realize that he's not okay in the head because of the decisions that he makes. And I feel like this is something very subtle that people might not pick up on, but I kind of liked it because I saw the little details in it. And when you look back on it, after you're done reading the story, it's kind of like, oh, wow, this is really kind of like a concerning thing that I didn't realize in the beginning. I just thought it was kind of casual, which is why I like this page that I chose. The reason as to why I chose the tone and of how I did it, just like a tone of kind of feeling judge of like, oh, people are looking at me and I'm against them and I just don't like the people around me. That's kind of the tone I try to emphasize upon based on what I read on the page. And I like the pauses that are made because I feel like that's how he thinks. He thinks in such a manner that doesn't make sense, that the feeling that he portrays isn't something natural to a reader. It isn't like it's something you would understand. It's just it doesn't make sense. It stands out. It sticks out, and his way of thinking also stands out because along with that, it's not normal. It's a bit psychotic, narcissistic. That's a feeling of him being against everyone and feeling disgusted by the people around him, which kind of a bit of craziness in my opinion. The tone that I previously talked about, I feel like that really portrays what's gonna happen later on in the story, and I feel like how the character himself, him at the end realizing that all those culminating emotions of not feeling any kind of emotion, at the end, he finally comes to terms with kind of feeling something. How when he's in prison, he finally realizes the gravity of the things around him and kind of feels happiness in the end because he finally comes to terms with his emotions and realizes that it doesn't matter because in the end everyone dies. In the end everyone has the same ending, and him finally feeling this sort of like embrace of happiness at the end just goes into further more in depth of just the way he thinks, the mind of just how far he's broken in the mind. And then along with my page, I went, obviously reread the book a couple times and tried to find quotes that really stuck out to me. And I feel like I found three quotes to me that kind of stuck out to me. One is, I open myself to the gentle indifference of the world. That's in page 132 in the PDF. And another one is, I looked up at the mass of signs and stars in the night sky and laid myself upon, for the first time, to the benign indifference of the world. And then lastly, after a while, you can get used to anything. Page 87 of the PDF of the book. Those three quotes I found really interesting because, to me, the three represent different things for the character. And the one that says, I open myself to the gentle indifference of the world, it's like he's kind of trying to feel some type of emotion. He's trying to find that purpose, trying to open himself up to feel something that he hasn't felt. And then the one that says, I look up at the massive signs and the stars in that sky and lay myself upon, for the first time, to the benign indifference of the world. I feel like that really is him trying to truly open up. Like before, the quote that I mentioned before, that's just like kind of him feeling it. This is him having a kind of self-talk to himself where he's looking up at the sky. And usually when you look up at the sky, it means you're kind of thinking of, I guess, yourself, how we live in a world that we've yet to really go into depth with it. And I feel like when a person looks up in the sky, they usually are searching for answers that they themselves can't find within themselves. And then lastly, the one that says, after a while you can get used to anything. I feel like that really can emphasize his crazy aspect as to where like no emotion can really matter, be of any effect after a long period of time, that you become numb to that emotion, so you can get used to it. And I feel like all those three quotes kind of signify who he is as a character. A comparison that I can make between The Stranger and another short story that I've read myself can be The Telltale Heart, because I feel like in a sense it kind of examines two sides of the same coin, in a sense of both of these main characters are crazy, but they don't act the same. And The Telltale Heart, um, one of the characters, he is insane and he kills the old man in order to get the old man's blue eye. And his whole premise is just acting like he just took something so valuable, and yet he has a completely different sense to the male protagonist in The Stranger. The male protagonist in The Stranger doesn't really have any type of emotion or any type of attachment. He kind of just does things for doing them. There's no purpose behind his thinking. And that's just two things that I feel like are both sides of the spectrum that can be compared in stories, which I really think I find it really interesting. Thank you very much for listening to the Adoah podcast by Noah Manassin, Amal Jackson, and Derek Morales. I hope you come back and listen to some more interesting and wonderful talks about literature.